Chapter 31. Priests, Gods, and Shadows. It was the line that the goddess crossed at the end of the 1960s that would trigger a metamorphosis of morality, ethics, values, society, culture, perception, and human nature of seismic proportions. The altering of desire. It was all there, implicit from the beginning, and made clear over and over again in the ancient inscriptions. May Ishtar, mistress of battle and conflict, turn his masculinity into femininity. She was continually praised for her power to turn a man into a woman and a woman into a man. Implicit in the changing of sexuality is the changing of desire. A man transformed by the goddess into a woman would presumably now desire men. A woman changed into a man would presumably desire women. This brings us into the realm of altered desire. The goddess herself boasted of being able to change back and forth between female and male. Though unspoken, it would be implicit that her desire as a woman would be for a man and as a man for a woman. Beyond that, she was the one especially invoked when one was seeking to alter another's romantic or sexual desire. She was the sorceress. It was her power to change desire. Then there were her priests, her performers, the cultic ministers of her temples, the men who dressed in female garments and took on female appearance. They would serve as examples of her power to alter sexuality, but her transformation went beyond clothing or outward appearance. Some took on women's names, some would sing the cultic songs in the female dialect, some even took on roles akin to consorts or wives. Exile of the Asinu. Thus it was more than appearance or mannerisms, it was sexual. Ancient Akkadian texts give instructions to men on having sexual relations with the Asinu, Ishtar's feminized men. It was thus a feature of the goddess's worship for her male priests to perform sexual acts with other men. A large part of Ishtar's priesthood would today be classified as homosexuals or gay, and her cult as one of androgyny, transvestism, and cross-genderism. When Western civilization turned away from paganism and the gods and goddesses went into exile, the condoning of homosexuality and other related behaviors came to an end. When the goddess went into exile and her temple closed, the Asinu priest and her other cross-gendered cultic personnel left the temples and followed the goddess into exile. They disappeared. In the new era in civilization, gender-crossing practices such as homosexuality and transvestism would be seen as immoral, sinful, inversions of the natural order. Such things would now be prescribed by codes of morality, societal convention, law, and scripture. Their licentiousness and transgressions for which the goddess's sanctuaries were known would now fade into history, become distant memories, and then be forgotten. The emergence of the shadow man. But if the goddess was to return, what would we expect to happen? We would expect that the values and practices of her cult and worship would return as well. In other words, if the goddess whose religion involved the acceptance, the open practice, the sanctification, and the enshrinement of homosexuality was to return, then her return would again bring about the acceptance, the open practice, and the sanctification of homosexuality and its re-enshrinement in Western civilization. And that is exactly what would happen. The goddess would cause homosexuality to come out of the shadows, out of the realm of the forbidden, and introduce it to a civilization to which it was alien and taboo. And when that would take place, it would not be so much a diverting of the sexual revolution, but its logical conclusion. The two priesthoods. The dynamic could be seen in the goddess's ancient cult of worship, her female priests and workers, the Harimtu, the Kesertu, the Sahatu, and the Istaru, engaged in sexual activity outside of marriage, but they did so with men. So sexuality was at first removed from the one context, that of the marital covenant, but remained within the other, male-female sexuality. But with Ishtar's male priesthood, from the Asinu to the Gala, the divorcing of sexuality from its natural or traditional context, its decontextualization was taken to another level. The goddess's male priest removed sexuality from gender, from its biological context of male and female. Thus they represented a deeper level of decontextualization. One deconstruction would lead into the next. The deconstruction of sex. In the same way, it was the sexual revolution that led to the normalization of homosexuality. If sexuality would be removed from the context of marriage, as in the sexual revolution, then it would also be removed from the context of gender, as in the normalization of homosexuality. It was for that reason that the seminal event that introduced homosexuality into the mainstream of Western civilization did not take place at the beginning of the sexual revolution in the early 1960s, but at the decade's end. And as with Ishtar's male priesthood, it would represent a further and deeper stage in the decontextualization and deconstruction of sexuality. It went hand in hand with another of the goddess's works. She had already begun separating husbands and wives and blurring the distinctions between male and female. If men and women were now interchangeable in every other realm, then it was only a matter of time before they would be seen as interchangeable in the realm of sexuality. So the emergence of homosexuality in American and Western culture was the fruit of several movements, all of which had a common denominator, the goddess. Seismic night. It would all come to a head in 1969 on a summer night on the streets of New York City. In an explosion, it concerned a bar called the Stonewall Inn. It would lead into days of rage and violence and would trigger a new movement and cultural transformation. It was there, in the streets of New York City, that the goddess would make her stand and bring what had been hidden in the shadows into the spotlight of American culture, then Western culture, and finally the world. Her agenda was ultimately to take a Christian civilization, alter its values, its perception of marriage, gender, and sexuality, until it had been transformed into a pagan civilization. As with the other transformations, it would have to be carried out step by step, first by mentioning the unmentionable, then by making the shocking familiar. From there the culture would be moved to toleration, then acceptance. That which was one unmentionable could become established, celebrated, championed, and then enforced. As she had introduced the transformation on the streets of New York, she would then introduce it into media, film, theater, television, music, politics, law, the educational system, children's cartoons, cereal boxes, everywhere. It would continue its saturation until there was hardly a facet of modern culture that had not been touched or altered by it. Laws would be overturned, and what was formerly illegal would now be celebrated. The overturning of something so basic to civilization as the male-female paradigm and norm would prove especially potent in the transformation of American and Western culture. The other coming out. When the gods departed from Western civilization, the open practice of homosexuality went with them. Both disappeared into the shadows and fringes. Therefore, the reappearance of homosexuality onto the center stage of Western civilization, its re-emergence from the shadows and closets of that civilization after 2,000 years was a sign there were others who were also re-emerging. They were likewise coming out of the shadows at the fringes of Western civilization. After 2,000 years, the gods. Round 2. It would signify as well another change of colossal magnitude. With the disappearance of the gods and that of the open practice of homosexuality, it was a sign that Western civilization had turned to the gospel, to the Christian faith. Therefore, the return of homosexuality to the center of Western civilization was a sign not only of the return of gods, but of a seismic change with regard to spirituality. It was a sign that Western civilization was turning away from the Christian faith. After nearly 2,000 years, the bond joining together, that civilization and that faith was beginning to dissolve. Each major step taken toward the establishment of homosexuality would be matched by an inverse step toward the disestablishment of Christianity. Every movement to celebrate homosexuality would lead to an inverse movement away from Judeo-Christian faith or the attacking of biblical values. The embracing of the morality embodied by the goddess was both a measure of and an instrument for the de-Christianization of America and Western civilization. The goddess was now casting a deeper spell. She had altered desires and the perception of a nation. The civilization that had once stood for Christian values was now championing the very things it had once condemned and condemning the very things it had once championed. It was celebrating what it had once forbidden and forbidding what it once celebrated. American Western culture would be converted and would become pagan. And yet she was not finished. The mystery and metamorphosis had to proceed to its next and even deeper stage. What would happen next had its origin in the goddess's ancient hymns, in the ministers of her cult, in her powers, and in a mysterious entity from her mythology.